Okay, welcome to our latest, excuse me, How to Electrify Buildings in Truckee, Tahoe webinar. We're delighted this morning to have as our presenter Debbie New, who is the head of Vermont Community Thermal Networks. A few housekeeping matters. We're going to have questions at the end. If you have questions as we go along, please put them in the chat and we will try to get to them. You'll also have the ability to ask questions in person at the end of Debbie's presentation. I'd like to mention that we have been under a PSOM warning this morning in Truckee, and we thought we had a PSOM, but in fact, Matt and I were in our homes in Tahoe Donner when power went out. And we are very thankful to the Lyft co-working space in Truckee, which is hosting us because we don't have any power where we normally host from. So thanks very much to the Lyft. Our guest is Debbie New. Debbie is a teacher and anthropologist by training. She has coordinated coalitions and working groups dedicated to decarbonization of the thermal energy sector. She launched Vermont Community Thermal Networks in 2022 to advance thermal energy solutions in the state of Vermont. But what they're doing there is very interesting, and we think we can all learn from it. We became familiar with it because we are part of a thermal energy group hosted by the Building Decarbonization Coalition. And we learned about a wonderful guidebook for local communities that Vermont Community Thermal Networks put together, and got in touch with Debbie because we were so excited about that and what she's doing in Vermont. Debbie is an organizer, a facilitator, a writer. A lot of her work involves leading action-oriented initiatives, such as Vermont Community Thermal Networks, creating supporting materials, translating technical information for decision makers, advocates, and the public. So, Debbie, welcome. We're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you. I'll just get my first slide up and then get going. Thank you very much for inviting me to talk with you all from one coast to the other, essentially. So I am the coordinator at Vermont Community Thermal Networks. We're a very small organization, and you can see here the kinds of things we do, from education advocacy through project development with a lot of other expertise involved, and also working on policy. And I'll talk more about all of that. So I was asked to start by telling you a bit about how I got here. And while I grew up in Vermont, I spent some time in Massachusetts really working on climate and clean energy there. That's how I got my start. And our focus there was on gas and methane emissions. And I say our because I was part of a coalition of people and organizations that were addressing the leaky gas system. And I don't know how much you know about the Northeast and our gas distribution systems, but they're old and they are leaky. So we were addressing the issues of gas leaks. And you can see here that this is my doorknob on the right from where I lived. And my gas company, Eversource, which is the same gas company that is doing the pilot of network geothermal in Framingham, Massachusetts, which you may have heard about. But at the time, they were encouraging me to switch to natural gas, even though I already had gas in my apartment. So sometimes it felt like there was gas everywhere. So the coalition that I was part of did a lot of education and advocacy, but also research and reporting on gas leaks. We did some of the first work on finding what the chemicals are in the fracked gas that is coming into our homes. You may have seen multiple studies about that since then, but here's one of our researchers at a boiler in a home recording information about the chemicals and the gas that's leaking there. We also tracked gas leaks in the streets. We measured, we reported, and we took action on that. Our advocacy focused on health, as I mentioned, and safety. That's where we found ourselves testifying on the same talking points as the gas worker unions. You can see in the upper right-hand corner, the three gentlemen there became our allies because we were all concerned about the safety of the gas system. And many of us were also concerned about climate impacts from all of this leaking methane. So we also, in addition to focusing on the problem, we tried to find solutions. And one of those solutions that we were advocating for was first described as pruning the tree, which I love. It came from a tree physiologist at Boston University who helped us imagine that the gas system is a lot like a tree underground, going out from a central point and distributing the gas through the trunks and the boughs and the twigs on the end. And he said, why don't we start at the end at those twigs and start replacing the gas system with other solutions and gradually pruning it back until we don't have gas in our communities anymore. So instead of having gas in pipes, what we advocated for was water in pipes to take geothermal and ground source heat pump solutions and network them. It's not an original idea, but to do that where the gas system was really leaky, and instead of replacing gas pipes, replacing with network geothermal pipe systems. So all of that work led me back to Vermont, my home state, and I just thought I'd share a few pictures of Vermont with you as I talk about it. We don't have mountains that are as tall as yours, but we do have a cold climate. So while we might not get the volume of snow, we have quite a bit of it and can get really cold here. Like you, we also have a tourism economy here that relies on all seasons to support our economy here, whether it's the fall foliage or the skiing or summer sports on our rivers and lakes. We also have climate impacts, and this is a photo I took in a town I lived in Waitsfield, when a hurricane came through and flooded our town. And this was, since then, there have been several floods that have really devastated communities in Vermont. We also get wildfire smoke here from California, from Canada, and there have been some days when it wasn't safe for us to go outside and breathe the air from all that smoke. So we have much in common with you, and maybe we have this in common as well, that we have a strong local identity in our towns and in our communities. Town meetings here are a thing. People get together at least once every year and they debate and they decide things together. We also have food co-ops and food hubs and local food systems that people are developing. Community solar is something that many Vermont towns have worked on and still want to expand. So this is a big part of how we approach problems that we need to solve here. So before I go on, I want to make sure that the landscape of fossil fuels in Vermont is clear. So this is what you need to know, that the gray parts here on this map from the Northeast Gas Association, the green parts, are where we have gas in Vermont. So it's 55,000 customers and 3 counties, although it doesn't cover all of even those 3 counties. The rest of the state, sure, there's a good bit of wood heating, but it's mostly oil and propane. So that leads to significant energy burdens because Vermonters are paying high prices to keep their propane and oil tanks full. And who knows what's going to happen with the prices of that, but many people are choosing either to buy food or medicine or heat their homes. So Vermont Community Thermal Network started out of this issue because Vermont was trying to figure out how to solve this problem of getting people off of fossil fuels, in particular off of oil and propane, which is unregulated in Vermont. So when I arrived back in Vermont from my work in Massachusetts, people here were debating quite intensely what we could do instead. And it seemed to be a choice between biofuels and people didn't know what. So we needed other solutions. It was clear that we hadn't arrived yet at something that everybody could agree on and that was going to work. We need something that people could say yes to, essentially. So I asked, well, what about geothermal and ground source heat pump systems? And people said, well, we tried that about 20 years ago and it didn't work very well. So I asked, well, what about networked geothermal? Knowing about what was going on in Massachusetts and other places, this kind of system. And the response that I mostly got was, what's that? So I started working on trying to put this solution on the table. And it wasn't just about networked geothermal because I learned about thermal energy networks and the value of waste heat. So we have a lot of heat that we already are creating and that is just going down the drain or out of our ventilation systems. So one of those big sources is wastewater. So think about the water that you use, that a business would use, a laundromat, a car wash, a hospital, a hotel. And much of that water we heat up and then we flush it down the drain. So that's heat that's been produced and paid for. Well, we can harvest that heat. We can access it at the building, at the sewer line, or at the gold mine, that's the wastewater treatment plant, where there's a lot of heat. And that heat can be recaptured and repurposed and shared among buildings. The other source of waste heat that's really important is waste heat from ventilation systems, and that often comes from refrigeration because to cool things down, like in your refrigerator, we need to reject heat. That's like how a heat pump works. So imagine a big heat pump, a big refrigeration system like a supermarket or an ice arena or other large buildings where the cooling needs to happen. There's a lot of heat that's leaving those buildings that we can capture and repurpose as well. There are other things like solar PV and other sources of thermal energy and thermal storage that we can integrate into a thermal energy network. And it turns out that waste heat is a thing here in Vermont. Although you might think we don't have big buildings and a lot of waste here, many communities are putting in or needing to expand, upgrade, or fix their water and wastewater systems. So you can see people in the upper left-hand corner are visiting their local wastewater treatment plant to learn more about that. We also need to create more density in our communities, and that means building new housing, making places more walkable, and revitalizing our downtown. And those are all really important opportunities for creating a thermal energy network. And I could talk more about that. And it turns out that Vermont businesses are creating a lot of heat that's being wasted. So whether it's cheese or a certain kind of ice cream or breweries or even the ski industry, there's a lot of heat out there that we can reuse. And in particular, the ski industries are really interesting because here we need snowmaking ponds in order to make snow. So that's a source of thermal energy right from those bodies of water that we can use. But also the compressors that make snow put off a lot of heat. So it turns out that thermal energy networks make a lot of sense here. And this is a map where all those gray spots show where we have enough density or we are going to have density enough. We're going to have business growth and housing growth in order to create thermal energy networks and have them make sense there. So these are designated town centers, intentional growth areas where our towns intend to expand, and industrial parks that are trying to recruit new businesses. So if we can offer clean heating and cooling in these places, we're going to be a lot better off economically. And that's a big factor that is motivating Vermonters to check this out. So this brings us to Vermont Community Thermal Networks and what we do. We're a statewide organization, and what we do is tap into the expertise we already have here in Vermont and bring in needed expertise from out of state. We're engaging communities about this, and we're also coordinating with Vermont organizations and coalitions and national networks as well. So the focus of our work here is community-driven thermal energy networks. This work is place-based because putting communities first in this process makes sense when we're already talking about local thermal resources. And it's about meeting local goals and needs, as well as staying flexible and introducing thermal energy networks as something that we can take multiple pathways in order to implement here. In other states, it's mainly investor-owned utilities that you might be hearing about doing these projects, although that's not true across the spectrum, or it's private companies. So here in Vermont, we are not starting with laws that mandate that utilities do these kinds of pilots, but we're starting with where heat is in our communities and finding out who's interested. So we're not relying on corporations to do this for us. And in our outreach and education and advocacy, we find that there are a lot of people interested, and we're not doing this by ourselves. Here are some of our state and regional partners. In Vermont, we have an efficiency utility called Efficiency Vermont, town energy committees, regional planning commissions, and regional economic development corporations are all in on this. We have a bond bank, which is essentially a green bank for municipalities, and an economic development authority, which is essentially a green bank for businesses, as well as other networks and coalitions. So the other part of our work, besides education and outreach, is about policy, because in Vermont, we needed authority in order to do this locally. So Vermont is a Dillon's rule state, which means that whatever is in a town charter is what matters. Well, we didn't find many town charters that say explicitly you can go ahead and implement a thermal energy network and set it up as a local utility. So we passed a law that just got passed at the end of May this year, and it's pretty simple. It's about 2 pages long, and there can be a link in the chat to a page on our website that tells more about it and has a link to the actual language if you'd like to see it. But essentially, this law allows any municipality in Vermont to implement a thermal energy network and establish it as a utility without Public Utility Commission or state approval and regulation, just like municipal water and sewer utilities operate under local control. So this local control isn't limited to municipalities. Cooperatives and other entities that are locally governed, in other words, that have members that vote or that can control decision making, any of those are the same as a municipality under this law. So it's not just municipalities, it's others as well. And we do have a strong tradition in Vermont of cooperatives. People understand that model here. The law also incorporated a mandate for a study on investor-owned utility thermal energy networks and what regulations are needed to put in place before those can be approved. So that's underway now. It just opened yesterday and will be due in December of 2025. And then Vermont Gas Systems, which is our only investor-owned gas company, could move ahead with projects. So when we advocated for this law, we didn't find any opposition to it at all. In fact, people kind of shrugged and said, well, sure, makes sense. So now we have that green light. So with that education and with the policy in place, I wanted to break it down a little bit for you and show you how we talk about this in Vermont. And where we start is that heat is a precious resource. Now, this is obvious to Vermonters who experience our winters, but it's an important place to start because we spend a lot of time and effort and money trying to make heat and move it to where it's needed and save as much of it as we possibly can. And what about cooling? That's something that we're not very well set up for here, but we're going to need it more and more as our climate warms. So we talk about thermal energy networks as something like this in a Vermont town. You can see here that we have multiple sources of thermal energy. The supermarket is contributing heat from the fans on top into the network from its refrigeration inside. There are multiple buildings where the wastewater is allowing heat to be recovered and put into the network. And you can see under the town green, there's a geothermal bore field, which is an important component of this for stability to supply that moderate constant temperature we can get from underground and provide reliability as well as storage for the system. So when we talk to people about this, we say thermal energy networks use ground source heat pumps and underground pipes to connect multiple buildings and provide heating, cooling, hot water, and importantly, thermal storage. And we emphasize that thermal energy networks use heat that already exists across a community, in many cases has already been paid for, and would otherwise be discarded, in fact, is most often being wasted. Importantly, we focus on the fact that this kind of heat can be used efficiently. And I want to show you how we talk about this. We juxtapose the air source heat pump with a ground source heat pump and how they function. We always say that it's really important to note that air source heat pumps do work and are an important solution to implement, especially in more rural areas where it doesn't make sense to install a network. So in this illustration, you can see that an air source heat pump has to pull from whatever the outside air temperature is. And at certain times of the year, that means it has to do a lot of work to get from 0 or 90 or so degrees to get to what's comfortable inside. In contrast, a ground or water source heat pump is receiving that a moderate temperature from water in pipes. And that means that it doesn't have to work as hard in order to get to that 70 degrees or so that we want our homes and our buildings to be. In fact, if you add waste heat into the system, those temperatures can be even higher and arrive at much closer to what we want to have inside. That means that a ground source heat pump uses much less electricity at those times of year than an air source heat pump, and really can help us electrify by making sure we're using electricity where we really need it and using other resources like this, resources we already have, where we can. So we focus on the benefits of thermal energy networks that involve energy savings and the associated cost savings. And you can see those here. Obviously, there's no fossil fuels, which means we have cost stability and predictable bills. We don't have to rely on whatever we can get, considering global markets and political instability and supply and all of that. We already have the thermal energy here. And because the component, the ground source heat pump, is so highly efficient, we have lower operational and maintenance costs and longer last equipment because there's less wear and tear on it. It doesn't have to work as hard, as I said. And there's less electric use overall, which means less demand on the electric grid. These systems shave those electric peaks that are costing us the most. And that means electric bill savings for customers and for all of us. So this is where we pause and we talk about thermal energy networks as shared infrastructure, much like our water and wastewater systems. It's water in pipes. We already know how to do this. We can lay pipes in our streets. We have ways to deliver customer service and billing. And in fact, water and wastewater systems require treating the water to make it potable or to make it something that we can flush into our rivers or lakes or wherever the wastewater goes. So a thermal energy network can actually be simpler than a local water or wastewater department is used to dealing with. So considering the energy savings and cost savings, when you have shared infrastructure like this, it can yield all kinds of community benefits. And this is a short list of what we're hearing is most important to Vermont communities. And economic development and downtown revitalization are often top of the list for people because offering clean heating and cooling can be an incentive to retain and also attract businesses and workers and create the kind of communities that we need. It can also make affordable housing possible, more possible, by lowering construction costs, because if a developer can tap into a heating and cooling system that's offered by a municipality, offered locally, then they don't have to bear the costs of putting that infrastructure in for themselves. And the residents can pay less because over time, those bills are going to be lower and more predictable than oil and propane for sure. These systems also add to resilience, which is a big deal considering that picture of the flooding that I showed you before. Because the components are inside or underground, they're much more resistant to extreme weather and all kinds of disruption. And they also provide quality jobs because whether people work for a gas system or for an oil or propane delivery company, many of them essentially are plumbers and pipe fitters, which are the skills needed in order to install and maintain these systems. Also, our oil and propane companies, many of them are local and family-run businesses. So this gives them an opportunity to be part of the energy transition and evolve their businesses. So this is an example that we share with people so they can understand what we're talking about and that it's possible. This is not Vermont, but it's a community that's similar in that it's rural and it also has a population of about 2,700 people. But they have a municipal thermal energy network that's been operating since 2012. And how they did it was that they had decided to put a geothermal system in their courthouse. Well, the businesses around that town square wanted that kind of clean heating and cooling as well for lower prices. So they asked if they could be part of it. The engineer said, well, sure, we could send you a pipe. And the municipality decided that they could own the system, but lease it to an LLC that was set up to include all the businesses that were tapping into that community shared system. So there's more to say about this Green Streetscapes project. They also incorporated all kinds of walkability and safety features in their downtown, and they have definitely seen the economic benefits of implementing this kind of energy system themselves. So in order to advance this in Vermont, we really follow three main principles. And one is to start small, in that we don't have to do everything at once. But you can see in this picture, in the lower right-hand corner, there's a community school. Across the street is a wastewater department where they already need to expand what they have there. So there's a project underway that a thermal energy network could fit into. And to the left, you can see there's a senior living community that could tap into the system as well. So you could connect 2 or 3 of these and start a thermal energy network, then phase in other nearby buildings over time. So this makes it manageable. The other thing that we're working on is to allow local control. And that means that because we're using local thermal sources, it makes sense for the community to be involved in designing a project and also in how it's going to work. And finally, we want to make sure this contributes to local goals, whether it's about adding housing, updating wastewater or water systems, or addressing climate resilience. So when we get people together to talk about this, we hold community workshops, and we're basically asking 3 questions. What's already happening here? Where could this work? And who's needed? In order to get to our goal to identify an approach and a project that's acceptable locally. So a thermal energy network in this way comes from here, wherever here is. It fits the local conditions, and we align ourselves with the people who can make it happen. And this is a view of some of our workshops. So we start by talking about what's already happening in that community, what projects are underway or in planning stages, what they need, and what they would like their community to be, what kind of community they want to live in. And we talk about how a thermal energy network can support those goals. We create big maps and we help people find where they already have heat by identifying certain kinds of buildings and facilities that are producing waste or excess heat. Then we find what buildings are nearby and we identify clusters of buildings and we talk about how you could phase in other buildings over time. And some people have gone so far as to visit their wastewater treatment plants to learn more and see if that could be part of their thermal energy network planning. So also in our work, we talk about local champions, local knowledge, and some of these things that you see here in bold. And I wanted to give you an example of how we do this. So this is a small city in sort of northeastern Vermont, and that town has been working hard to revitalize their downtown. And they're curious about how a thermal energy network could help. Our local champion there has been the town manager. And this is really important because not only is there leadership there, but also a network of people that we can tap into and identify what is most viable there. We also try to elicit local knowledge and put it to work. In other words, we found out here that it was not going to work to start talking about the climate and emissions reduction. But if we led with economic development and talked about downtown revitalization, people would pay attention. And eventually we could start talking about energy savings and cost savings, but still not talk about climate. And essentially we learned here to highlight what's in it for you, rather than take a good bit of time and talk about the technology and how it works. We needed to get more quickly to tell people how it could benefit them. And here we're starting small, putting that principle to work. There's a municipal building that's already in progress to get updated, in fact, a complete renovation. To that project, we can add 2 adjacent buildings and then others in that block, and later extend to a school and senior housing, so that we really are starting with just 3 buildings and then involving others as we go. The ownership here needs to be flexible. I mentioned multiple pathways to get this done, and that requires being flexible about how a system can be owned and operated. And here, what seems to work locally is that because it's a town building, it's more likely that town ownership could work here, and people are more open to it because they see how it could benefit their municipal building and their municipality as a whole. They do, however, want a third party to be involved in order to manage the system rather than taking it all on themselves at once. So they're considering a contract where the town would own it, but would contract with another company and potentially, like in West Union, Iowa, set up an LLC in order to make it happen. And the benefits that are emerging here as the most important ones that we're emphasizing are to relieve financial pressure on existing projects like that municipal building project. So that becomes more doable by creating this shared infrastructure around it and lowering costs. Also, we're looking at affordable heat for affordable housing that's nearby and how to tie that in, and creating an identity for their downtown. We're calling it a Main Street Thermal Energy Network, and it's part of their focus on creating a main street that people can really gather around and identify as a core part of their community. So we're finding that thermal energy is actionable locally, and thermal energy networks in particular are an actionable solution. And the pins in this map show you many of the places where we're having active explorations of this. So it's spread across our state. And what we're hearing from people is, as one person said, the technology is straightforward and well established. Small groups of people can actually do this. It's achievable. And another person, unsolicited, said, I like that we're not replicating something prepackaged. We're asking questions, learning, and implementing ourselves so people are more willing, more receptive. Our town has agency. So to do this work, we've developed some materials, and this is the toolkit that was mentioned at the top of the webinar, how to develop a thermal energy network. We created this as it says, a practical guide. We felt municipalities needed this kind of information. Communities needed to know where to start and what a project might look like and what they needed to do to make it happen. Well, it turned out the process of creating this was mostly helpful to us to learn how to do this in person and in place with people. So we learned a lot putting it together, and it turns out it's been helpful to some communities outside of Vermont. So I wanted to talk through the components of this briefly with you. So it has basically 4 sections. The first is start here. Then it goes to identifying opportunities, understanding ownership, and developing your project. So let's start with start here. The toolkit has 1 page for each of these sections, which we've tried to make as streamlined and user-friendly as possible. So you can see here in the orange block, there's a main resource that is called Where and When a 10 Makes Sense, which is about where to look for thermal energy networks locally. You can see there's some actions to take and a worksheet and some supporting materials, essentially several of our fact sheets. So this is the chart that goes with start here. And you can see there's simple questions that you can tick off yes or no, and you can get an idea of how many local conditions you have in your town that could lend themselves well to a thermal energy network. And even having one of these could be a good reason to advance a thermal energy network exploration. The second section, identify opportunities, is essentially about site selection. And we ask people to look for buildings that are going to be producing heat that could be repurposed. So this is also where we talk about waste heat from refrigeration and wastewater, so people can learn about what to look for and what buildings to match with buildings where there's already heat being produced. And this doesn't mean that people have to jump into a thermal energy network project. There's lots of things people can do in order to be what we call 10 ready. So they can inventory their thermal energy resources and inventory potential buildings to connect to the network, and then create a simple map. They can also identify upcoming development projects, whether those are private developments or municipal projects in the works, and also adding thermal energy networks language to local and regional plans, whether they're town plans or energy plans. It's important to have that idea in there to make it easier to do a project when the time comes. And of course, retrofitting buildings along a potential route or in a potential cluster of buildings for thermal energy networks. In other words, weatherizing and insulating buildings and upgrading electrical systems is all work that can be done anytime. And we provide information to go with each of those so people can have more resources. The third section on understanding ownership is not just about ownership, but it's also about which ownership choice means what for financing opportunities. So we focus in this on 3 models: a cooperative, a municipal model, and a third-party ownership model. For each of those, we talk about the advantages and the challenges of each, and mainly we ask questions, or we suggest questions for people to consider to help them figure out which one makes sense where they are. And then from there to understand what that means for financing in terms of the IRA incentives that we have right now, and also who they might need to enlist to get help with figuring this out. Finally, develop your project is essentially what to expect when you're expecting a thermal energy network. It talks about the different phases of a project and what people can expect as the pipes go in the ground and the heat pumps go into the building. So I like to end where I began, essentially, which is the obvious statement that heat is a precious resource and that we have the heat we need, as well as opportunities to harness it. So I guess I wanted to conclude today by sharing a little bit of a perspective, what we're saying now about thermal energy networks and their importance. First of all, I want to add a personal note that I'm getting to know Vermont in a whole new way through this approach, in a way I otherwise wouldn't. And I'm really enjoying that part of the work. It's really fulfilling and meaningful to engage people in this solution and empower them, equip them to do this work themselves with support from the experts that we engage as well. Also, at this time, I'm feeling even more that local power and public power is important, and that no matter what changes at the federal level, it doesn't diminish the importance of the municipal or the local role in creating infrastructure that supports economic development and other goals that people have in our towns, in our communities. Essentially, a thermal energy network is a relocalization of energy and power. Also, thermal energy networks are really a conservative move because they're about using what we have, not about consuming more. And municipal energy is also conservative. Most public power in the US is actually in red and rural states like Tennessee and Nebraska, Ohio, Wyoming. So it's not a new idea. We're familiar with how to do this, and it's something that we can do for ourselves. So I really look forward to hearing what your questions are and also learning from what you're experiencing where you are, what you think is possible.
Debbie, that was wonderful. Hold on a second. We're having a little echo issue here. Oh, you need to. Okay, I think we got it settled. All right, thank you, Debbie. That was wonderful. I have some questions for you. So these community events that you have done, have you found that getting community members involved in the process has increased their support for these projects?
Oh, absolutely. When people start learning not just about
Debbie, you're muted. Or maybe not.
Didn't look like I was. Can you hear me?
Oh, no, I hear you now. Go ahead.
Okay. So yes, when people start learning that yes, there's geothermal that can be networked, but there are also other sources of heat.
Can you
that
turn
can.
your volume down? Because I'm going to turn mine up. We're
So-
having a little technical difficulties here.
Yeah, that's
We're
fine.
sharing a room, so it's a little complicated.
Yeah, I understand. So when people start looking around and realizing that their local grocery store or the bakery down the street could be part of this, that could contribute to it. In fact, these places could sell the heat they have into the network and get revenue from it to lower their own energy costs. People start getting very interested because it's a direct impact. It's not just the idea of lowering emissions, clean energy, those sort of vague concepts to people. It really closely impacts people and their daily lives.
Oh, that's a new concept to me personally. The idea that folks providing heat in the winter, especially, could actually get money from that. So that means you need to have a meter not just on the one side of the network going into the building. You also have to have a meter on the as the water coming from the building goes into the network. So
Well,
interesting.
it doesn't necessarily have to be metered. There are other ways to figure out how much thermal energy is moving where, and it can be based on kilowatt hours, on the electricity that's needed to run the pumps. So there are many ways to figure out the financing of this and the revenue portions of it as well.
Great. Okay. So how many thermal energy networks have either been completed or in the planning stages in Vermont that you know of?
I know of two, and they're already constructed, so they exist prior to this push we're making for thermal energy networks. They're great examples for us to use. We do have some, and I can tell you more about that in a minute. We have some projects that are getting much closer to financing and successfully financing them, but there are no shovels in the ground on the projects that we've been exploring. We've been at this for 2 years, only starting from pretty much zero. So that's where we are right now. But the existing projects are a college campus, which if you're familiar with network geothermal and thermal energy networks, you know there are many colleges that are putting these in or already benefiting from these systems. So we have one of those here, and it's a great example because they have new construction and retrofit historic buildings on their system, and they're expanding it. The other is a private thermal energy network that has about 3 buildings to it, and it is using an aquifer underground. It's an open loop system, and in that way is another really interesting example. They've also done a ton of building envelope and interesting, energy efficiency measures. So it's actually an award-winning system.
Great. So have you, so here in the Truckee area, getting drilling companies interested in this kind of stuff is problematic. We seem to have a shortage of drillers and they have other things going on. So I'm just curious, have you run into that issue at all in Vermont where you're having a hard time finding drilling companies?
Well, it's definitely a concern. Do we have enough drillers? Do we have enough drill rigs, drilling companies? So we're currently looking at an inventory of that. Some of that work has already been done. Luckily, we have one drilling company where the head of that company has been the head of the National Groundwater Association. So he is very much aware, and they already have many of these drillers working on geothermal projects for individual buildings. And so we're investigating what more we need to do here. We're learning from Massachusetts, where they just implemented a new curriculum on drilling, and they graduated a bunch of young new drillers. And we're talking with them about importing that curriculum. And I know they're talking about expanding that to many places.
Excellent. We have a question here from one of our audience members. Can you speak to the useful life of a ground coupled system versus an air source heat pump system versus a gas fired system?
I don't know that much about gas-fired systems and how long they last, but we do talk about the difference between a ground and an air source system. So the ground source system, what I'm hearing from the industry is that the heat pumps themselves are at least 25 years in terms of their longevity, and the pipes underground, 100 years or more. They're durable plastic pipes, so they can last quite a while. An air source heat pump, part of the concern there is the change in refrigerants, which is going to be mandated. So it's not just about air source heat pumps having to work harder to do the job and not lasting as long. I think I'm hearing like 12 to 15 years at best for an air source heat pump. But also we're going to have air source heat pumps that meet the refrigerant requirements. A ground source heat pump has some refrigerant in it, but it's factory sealed. And so it's not something that would be changed out. It's not something that's emitting in the way that greenhouse gas emitting refrigerants are doing with air source heat pumps right now.
Great. Let's see. Yeah, in fact, I know that with mini split systems versus you can have air source heat pump systems that are coupled to ducted system. You obviously have a lot more refrigerant involved in a mini split system, especially if it's a larger home with many rooms where you have lots of indoor units, and so that can involve quite a bit of refrigerant lines which need to be charged, and as you mentioned, aren't factory sealed, so always more likelihood of leakage. So definitely worth worth thinking about. Let's see here. So in Vermont are 10 projects, thermal energy network projects. Are they using antifreeze in the ground loops?
Yeah, the ones that I'm aware of are using some glycol, which is a food grade antifreeze, as you mentioned. I know that people in Massachusetts and New York are feeling like there are projects that they're working on that don't need that glycol in the system. It can actually be just water and pipes. So that depends on the design and also the conditions in that place.
And are you finding that the use of the antifreeze is making it, let's see, more problematic in terms of, rules governing distance from aquifers, from rivers, creeks, etc.?
We're not having a problem with that at this point, although we haven't really gotten into a lot of permitting issues around this. So it is something people are asking about and something we're investigating what we need to be prepared for with that.
Okay. And then, so let's just take, for example, this thermal energy network you were looking at in this small town where you have the municipal building and the two buildings neighboring it. So in a situation like that, how would you manage the fact that there's different owners? How do you arrange the cost sharing and all that?
Well, the system would be municipally owned. So whether it's that place or it's another place that has a local entity that's owning and operating it, it would essentially function as a utility. And so each customer, depending on their heating and cooling load, would be billed monthly, a fixed fee. But also in terms of financing it, it makes sense to have a reasonable upfront connection fee, which in West Union, Iowa is a couple of $100s. We're looking at about $1,000 for a business or an organization to hook up to the network in order to make it pencil out. Those are really preliminary numbers. But the idea is to pay a one-time connection fee and then regular monthly bills over a longer period of time, like with any utility, where it would be paid back. And so those fees would be established based on the size and the heating and cooling load of each building.
Great. And Deidre has a question for you. I'll let her ask it.
Okay, actually, I have two questions. One is, does the legislation that was passed in Vermont that permits these local municipalities or local groups to establish a community thermal energy network permit financing over time as an ordinary utility would for infrastructure improvements? And then my second question also goes to financing, which is, how is Vermont Community Thermal Networks funded? And when you do these community meetings, who bears the costs of those?
Okay, I'll talk about the policy first. The policy is not explicit about financing over time, but it is talking about a utility model. not an investor-owned utility, but a municipal utility model, which does have ratepayers, have customers that have rates assigned to them and are charged over time in order to recover the upfront cost. So it's built into the policy, and that the law allows municipal thermal energy network utilities to be established like a water utility or a sewer utility in any town. So does that make sense, or do you have a? Okay, so then in terms of how Vermont Community Thermal Networks is funded, we have private foundation funding right now to do these workshops, so it's no cost to the communities for my time or the time of experts that I enlist in doing these workshops with me in order to have the technical information that we need. So that has definitely been a positive factor of finding people who believe in this work, who really value community ownership of local clean energy, and also people who are concerned about climate and energy justice issues that we're addressing.
Great. Well, that's it for the questions, and I'm going to hand it back over to Deidre to close it out. And thank you so much, Debbie. It was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you. It's really great to talk with you all.
Thank you so much, Debbie. That was a really interesting presentation. I really admire your community organizing work in Vermont. I want to let everybody know that this webinar has been recorded and it will be posted on the CTA webinar, the CTA website under webinars. Kaylee, would you like to say anything else?
Yeah, just that we will send out the link to the recording and it will be on the website, and we will not be hosting our monthly one in December. We're going to take a holiday break. So we'll be reaching out to everyone who joined us for this one and our previous webinars for our next webinar in January.
Okay. Thank you all very much, and we'll look forward to seeing you in the new year.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Debbie.
Bye. Thanks, Debbie.
Bye.